so great to be back at Da Vinci, but probably more importantly, it's you have forced me to sit down and spend, I think, Dee, how long we spent? Probably about 9 months. And I hope that by the time I finish this lecture, you might in fact feel inspired like I am about the future of this country, number one. And number two, I think we might have taken a bit of a risk, but we are presenting some work that we've dreamed about for the last 20 years. Whether in fact it is possible to produce a model for systems thinking. Because everybody says, what the hell are you doing? Systems thinking. Tell me what it's all about. Show me something. And so this journey that I'm going to take you on today might in fact give you a better insight into it. So the idea was that I started off and said, you know, what should I tell you? And eventually things started to fall in place, miraculously fall in place. And I hope that you will be convinced by the time I've finished that we've got something quite special. But you know, if I reflect on this journey since I really got involved in systems thinking around about 1984, I've had some amazing colleagues, I've had some amazing students, and I've had some amazing CEOs who've been prepared to risk themselves. Iron is one of them. We went on an interesting journey in UJ last year on systems and design thinking. And these are people who provided this unbelievable platform for us to experiment, to test. Benny, Dee, and I went to Germany, to Deutsche Telekom, to go and take this concept to places abroad. So I'm deeply indebted to these people. I'm also deeply indebted to a unique person by the name of Professor Iraj Zandi. He's an emeritus professor at Wharton and a unique man, and I'm going to tell you more about him. And then to my partner, Dee. She's an unbelievable systems thinker. She's just simply amazing. And she and I have had this unique relationship, and we've actually spent a lot of time going down this journey together and saying, can we take something that has been, you know, Leonardo da Vinci was the first person that really documented systems thinking. And every university in the world will have 3 or 4 professors that are working on systems thinking. And yet, it's hardly used. There's something wrong. And that's what we've tried to do, and hopefully we'll distill this in this lecture. There's an interesting guy who we brought out to Da Vinci, also from Wharton, from University of Pennsylvania, by the name of Johnny Pudina, who worked for 30 years with Russell Ackoff. And those of you who know the story, I apologize, but Ackoff is it was just emotional to be with Ackoff. Unbelievable systems thinker, but probably more importantly, one of the most controversial academics in the United States of America. One of the interesting things about Ackoff is that he was the personal advisor to the Bush family, and Anheuser-Busch, which has now took over South African breweries, the biggest Interbrew is the biggest brewery in the world. And Ackoff was a distinguished academic, worked at Wharton, and one day walked into the dean's office and he said, I'm firing you. And the dean said, what do you mean? And he says, I am leaving. And he left Wharton and went and wrote a book called Learning Upside Down. And if you haven't read the book, you will see this man's mind. It was amazing. And what he said is that as academics, we are really messing with the minds or the brains of our students. And particularly in the business schools, we actually are creating animals out of business schools that really are going to be misfits in the business environment. And then for the last 11 years, I've been an innocent bystander in a journey at the University of Johannesburg with Iron Rensburg. And I have to say to you now that it'll go down in history as the greatest social systems experiment in the country. And I just pray that Iron, when he leaves the university, is going to document the story. Because probably by accident and not by design, what has happened at UJ really I've used it to try and say, what can we do to take highly complex situations and actually make a meaningful contribution to society, to the people and the stakeholders that are involved in those particular areas. So that's been it. And you know, as I said earlier on, we've really spent all this time trying to convince people that systems thinking is the right way to go. And only now, this year, after 33 years of working in this field, do we actually see the realization of our work coming to fore. And people say to me, why are you so excited? And I say, well, I think that now our work is starting to show the emergence of the second democratic wave in this country. Everything that is happening in this country, every single day, you must rejoice, because I sincerely believe that systemically we're about to, in fact, become one of the greatest democracies in the world. So don't get upset that Brian Malefi is going back to Eskom tomorrow, all you Eskom employees, because it's tracking beautifully. It is actually tracking beautifully, and I hope to show that to you. So how did this all start? You heard from my CV, I was an engineer, and I was involved in pipelines. I've designed pipelines all over the world, big pipelines. And one day I got a phone call from Professor Zandi at the University of Pennsylvania. Zandi was, and still there's a formula called the Zandi-Kovatis formula to design massive pipelines. And he said to me, I desperately need your help because I'm getting involved in what was called the Etsi pipeline. The Etsi pipeline was to transport coal over nearly 1,600 kilometers, 30 million tons of coal a year. It was the biggest pipeline project in the world. And because at Wits we had the biggest or the largest research facility of its kind, they needed us to do all the testing on this coal. So coal was exported from the United States of America, came to my laboratory at Wits, and it was just amazing. And when you looked at it, everything tracked. Can you imagine? You can bury this pipeline underground, you won't see it. So from an environmental point of view, it was excellent. We even designed a return pipeline to take the dirty water back. So we had two pipelines. From a capital cost point of view, if you had to build another road or railway line, it was crazy. And probably more importantly, from a maintenance point of view, it was significant. So if you have a look at the history of Etsi, we were going to be able to transport coal at probably about 50% of the price of any diesel or any train. And so this was really exciting, and for us as pipeline engineers, it was just the most amazing experience in the world. And so what went wrong? So here was our pipeline. It was kind of from the mid of the United States of America down to the bottom part, and everything was in place. The only problem with Etsi was that we had to cross 65 railway lines. And in the United States of America, if the railway line is owned privately, and anything from the railway line, the surface of the railway, and right down to the devil, the railway guys owned it. So there were 65 court cases. 65 court cases to get property rights of way underneath the railway line. And so, and in the end, we had to get approval from Congress. And we sat here in South Africa, ready to, in fact, celebrate because everything was there. And guess what happened? We completely underestimated the railway lobby. And the railway lobby in Congress was just so powerful, they killed this project. Just to tell you how sad it was, that in 1984, the US Supreme Court awarded Etsi a $1 billion award because, in favor of Etsi in terms of suing the railway lines. And what happened from that day is that Zandi, who was a highly distinguished academic, turned around and said, my goodness, we have spent, I think the feasibility study was $30 million, Andrea, $30 million. Now we're sitting with a UJ feasibility study of what? Nowhere near that on the thin film solar stuff. And Zandi said, what have we done? What are we doing when we're training engineers? There's something fundamentally wrong. Because you tell an engineer, design a pipeline, and an engineer never turns around and says, what are the implications of this pipeline? Nobody, Bechtel, all the fancy consultants ever dreamed that there would be a problem, that the railway line, because it was the biggest step of the railway lines. And nobody ever understood the power of the railway lobby. And Zandi actually got off his seat as the head of Department of Civil Engineering at the University of Pennsylvania, oldest university in the United States of America, right at the top, and walked across to Wharton and went to Ackoff and he said, I have to come and talk to you. And Zandi actually then gave up engineering. And to be quite honest with you, a couple of months later, so did I give up. And we both started on this journey together on systems thinking. So I'm not going to tell you all the details of this journey, but just to actually turn around to you and hopefully that at the end of the day, the Etsi pipeline, Suzeka was the pipeline, and the biomimicry, I hope I'm going to convince you at the end of the day, that maybe we can, as people in this room here, learn a lot from nature. So the first thing I've done, and I need to just be very apologetic right up front, because in the time that I've got, I've had to take snippets, but as Dee and I sat down and said, what are the key things that we need to think about when we're going to try and present something to a very distinguished audience like all of you today? And we felt that there were three things. One was systems thinking. The other was complexity. You can't come and give a lecture at Da Vinci if you don't talk about complexity. Anderson will fire you, see? And then, of course, as you probably all know, Dee and I fell in love with this concept of wicked problems, and that's not what everybody thinks they are, okay? And so what we've tried to do is to actually persuade you that as we've gone through this journey, we've come up with the concept of these building blocks for this model. So as I said right in the beginning, Da Vinci was the one that actually spoke about this, and those of you who are very close to Da Vinci will know that the 7 Da Vincian principles are actually quite critical. But the point was that there are these interesting concepts, and so what can you do with these concepts? And all I've tried to do is to just bring out what I think are important issues that come out of all the work that people are doing around the world in systems thinking. And the first thing, as Andy said, is that a system is this construct that you, the designer, in fact, will put together from either concrete or abstract. But the point about it is that this assemblage must, in fact, meet 2 conditions. And the first one, it must exhibit emerging properties. If I walk into this room here with a steering wheel of my motor car, you will say, well, that's what you expect from an academic. This has absolutely no value in this room. If I take you outside and show you my car with, in fact, a shaft coming out of the floorboard, you will say that it's impossible to drive this car unless you're a South African taxi driver. The moment I take that steering wheel and I put it into my car, the steering wheel, in fact, emerges, and so does the car emerge. And in fact, that means that when you put this thing together, it emerges and it has a new shape. And that's quite critical. And the second thing, which is pretty obvious in systems thinking, that all the parts must be interacting with each other. The other important thing about systems thinking is this notion of open and closed systems. And perhaps this is something that we really need to enforce or reinforce. That an open system is when high levels of information move in and out. And it's actually, if you go and look at businesses, they would rather, in fact, be in a closed system because they want to try and protect themselves. They want to try and, in fact, shelter their organization and put in place these devices and instruments to try and, in fact, sort out or sort of protect the organization. And what happens is that as you close the organization, it disintegrates. And this is fundamentally important. And you will also see over here, which is going to come up quite a lot, is this notion of self-organizing. But in order to keep a system open, you have to pump energy into it all the time. The leader has to pump energy into it all the time. And it's this vigorous energy. The leader has to create a zone of feeling incredibly uncomfortable in the organization. So whereas everybody will strive and say, why do we have to have another restructure? Why do we have to actually go through another strategic planning exercise? That, in fact, is what we call an open system. You are willing to actually look around your environment and see what is taking place. I also thought it's quite important, if you read the book From Starfish to Spider and Back Again, this concept, it started off in the 1890s. If you went to go and listen to music, you would have just this memory in your mind. And then technology came along, and you found that, in fact, records came about. They were able to record this music. Eventually, you got the big 5. And then, right in the early 2000s, there was a cheeky guy by the name of Napster. And what did he do? He made music available free on the internet, completely illegal. And if you follow the Napster story, there are many, many court cases that they ran until they were able to close him down. The day they closed him down, a whole lot of other Napster lookalikes came along. And this is what we call peer-to-peer, or an extremely open system. And I just reflect on us talking yesterday at UJ. What is happening is that you don't know who you're dealing with. Fees must fall. Who are you dealing with? What is happening is, the previous president of the United States of America, Barack Obama, celebrated when they killed Osama bin Laden. They never destroyed the organization. A new leader popped up. And so this is starting to actually say to us that, we have to actually be really aware of this trend of what we call peer-to-peer, and it's something we need to take into consideration. Now, Zandi, in his work in systems thinking, started to start looking at organizations, and he said an important thing, that if you really want to actually look at how you are going to redesign your organization, you have to three things in place. The first is you have to know what the organization's current reality. What is it like right now? Let's put a dipstick into South Africa and say, what is it like now? He then came out with a very interesting the second state. He said, you must also ask yourself the question, if we continue to run our organization or our country the way we are running it now, that in fact is the as it will be state. And you just forget about what's happening, you blink it on and you just carry on running it. And this is what we call the early warning system. It's saying to you, if you carry on running South Africa the way you're running it, or your business or your organization, that is the early warning system. However, we all have a dream, either for ourselves, for our organization, and that's what he called the as it should be state. And he said to move from this as it will be state to the as it should be state, you're required to do design. And that you started to see the first time the guys at Wharton started to think about design thinking. Those of you who've been associated with me know that we are very much in favor of MESS, the MESS formulation. And the whole idea is that what you try to do when you define the current reality is that you actually try and identify the mess that the organization is in. So this was a model that we used here at Vinci for a long time, and we'll come back to it. And so in summary, what are the key issues about systems thinking? Obviously, the notion of connectivity, focusing on relationships and interrelationships are important. See patterns and not events. I'm once again going to point to Aaron. He will tell you an amazing story. That in the formation of UJ, the first thing that he was the chairman of the interim council, the body that brought this thing together, the first thing that happened is that he said, we need to go and actually get the unions on our side. I was given the task, thank you, Mr. Chairman, of going to negotiate with Vusi and Schlapu, the boss man of Nahawi. And I said to him, we've got to do something. And the deal was that we would not retrench anybody as a result of the amalgamation of Randolph Afrikaans University, Wits Technikon, and the two Vista campuses. However, we said that does not mean that if a person leaves or retires or decides to go away, that we would replace that person. And it was the most unbelievable relationship. On the 1st of January 2005, the flags go up and UJ, in fact, gets launched. Banners, everything is great. In June 2005, this is the first time the university starts negotiating with the unions. You would not believe that, in fact, we had gone on a honeymoon because the negotiations were acrimonious you cannot believe it. In 2006 was even worse. And then he and I started to engage with it. What's the pattern? Something happens in June and July every year. COSATU has its national conference. And we said to ourselves, why is UJ negotiating in June? He changes it to start negotiations August, September, October. Since then, touch wood. It might have taken a long time. There has never, ever been an incident like that. So systems thinking reinforces this notion of patterns. Subsystems is also critically important because when you start looking at a complex system, like the South African government, for example, and all the ministries and all that, they all are systems in their own right, but they obey the same laws. It gives us a better picture of a reality. It's a whole issue around what we call trying to actually give you an insight into the concept of unintended consequences. And finally, we say to ourselves that if you want to change the system, you either have to change the structure or you have to change the rules. So this is what we did. And I think that one of the most important observations that many of us made, and we only started to realize it late in life, was that perhaps one of the greatest living systems thinkers of this time was Nelson Mandela. And all of us who had the pleasure of working with him, when we used to engage with him as advisors, the man used to say, wait. We thought we had these great ideas. And he would take time and he would come back. And he'd say, that idea, and I could never understand what it was until I read that book, Playing the Enemy. And if you actually see, the man was a classic systems thinker. He knew that he had to appease the left of the left and the right of the right. And if you look at it, he made very, very few mistakes in his term of office. So what we say over here is that when you're standing behind a horse, it's hard to see the future's attractive. In other words, the concept is from systems thinking, you better actually be able to stand back and look at where you are. So I said to you that you would get fired at Da Vinci if you didn't look at complexity. And of course, all of you know that there are many models, but perhaps from a Da Vinci point of view, we'll talk about at least one model that's important. But I think it is important to actually turn around and say that perhaps the greatest change that we've ever experienced in the lives of all of us now came at the end of 2007, beginning of 2008. And if you read Friedman's book, I think the last edition was about 2007, when he spoke about the world is flat. And he spoke about this huge new playing field, this massive playing field. And then, apart from Benny Anderson, I'm not sure there are many other people in this room that's read The Black Swan. But Taleb, of course, is the guy. Taleb and one other person were the two people who warned the then President of the United States of America that, in fact, there was going to be this global economic crunch. And George Bush, in his own wisdom, decided to ignore it. But the point about it is that Taleb spoke about the great intellectual fraud. The notion that we all believe that the world behaves as a bell curve. And I always tell the story that when I was a junior lecturer at Wits, and I was lecturing systems, I used to say all these points that are sitting outside the bell curve is either due to an arithmetic error or you've made an error in measurement. And you know what you can do? You can ignore it. And what did Taleb do? He said it's exactly those things that you ignore are the things that, in fact, are creating the wicked problems. These are the things that are creating these things that are beyond as kind of normal expectations. And then Carlson also started to talk about this crisis of understanding, how this world is so confusing and how we are so conflicted about where we are in this thing. And I think, Benny, perhaps the other thing that we've probably all ignored is the notion of these artifacts that we've created. The notion that we've created software systems. And they've made, in fact, have created complexity in their own right. And it just reinforces this concept of Da Vinci and its focus on the management of technology. What is happening when we create these things which we think are going to make life easier? We think, in fact, are going to provide a better quality of life, when in fact they've probably contributed to complexity. And I thought, just to bring you up to speed, this came out 2 weeks ago. So Andy Dexter, just by the way, every night at about 7 o'clock at night, I get this. There's a group of people on LinkedIn on systems thinking. And it's profound. It's a worldwide group of people. And Andy Dexter came out with this about 2 weeks ago. And he said, I want to try and model the decision by the British Prime Minister to go for the referendum. And what he's done is, anything that's in red is in fact those people that in fact say, you must leave the EU. And everything that's in blue is you must remain in the EU. And what this model shows is how things are very, very complex. And this notion of we want to find a simple model is no longer valid. You can't find a simple model. So what he shows very, very interestingly is the various organizations, people, the culturally traditional people, those people that in fact are suffering, and what their kind of voting pattern will be in this referendum. So I now get my brownie points at Da Vinci because I'm going to show you Snowden. And Snowden, a highly controversial person. Just by the way, this LinkedIn thing, I would say probably at least once a month, there's a war between Snowden and the systems thinkers. The systems thinkers think he's a heretic, and he, in fact, is, I mean, God, does he fight? I mean, it's like unbelievable. But the point is the Carnarvon or Sinofan model is a model that actually works incredibly well. It came out of IBM, and it's been used in many, many environments. And he starts off and he talks about the 19th century concept, which is the simple one where you sense, you categorize, and you respond. And then he talks about the 20th century practice, which he calls complicated. And here, you sense, you analyze, and you respond. And then he talks about this whole influence of the social media and this complex environment, where what you do now is you probe, you sense, and you respond. And then he talks about chaos. In this chaos environment, you act, you sense, and you respond. And in the middle of this model, he talks about disorder. And basically what he says is that the environment disorder is you don't know what the hell to do. You really don't know what to do. But why I've quoted this to be serious about it is that because this model really works. But in the war between Snowden and other people in the complexity world, is a guy by the name of Stacy. And the Stacy model has 4 environments. The first environment is where, in fact, you talk about rational decision-making. Sorry about the slide. The second one is political decision-making, which you can probably see where, in fact, because he plots far from agreement, close to agreement, and close to certainty and far from certainty. The third environment is judgmental decision-making. And then the fourth one is, in fact, what we would call unintended consequences in our world. And in the middle over here is this interesting thing which he calls the zone of complexity, where the organization, in fact, is starting to move. There's an unsettledness in this thing. And it's vigorously dynamic. There's high energy, there's creativity, and there's innovation. And it can either, be a stable organization, or in fact, it can be a chaotic organization. So in this competition between Stacy and Snowden, I would say it's probably 50-50. People believe in Snowden, other people believe in Stacy. But once again, when you use the Stacy model, it's been applied in many, many real situations, and it's important. It's interesting that when I met Dee, she was started her own business shortly after we met, and being an engineer, engineers love entropy. The Dean of Engineering is here from UJ, and all they talk about is entropy. And in layman's terms, entropy is like another measurement of energy. But Dee ran a business which in fact developed a highly sophisticated tool to go into organizations and measure their entropy. And those of you who want to know about the history of Da Vinci, when in fact it was all agreed that I would set up Da Vinci, in the agreement I was told that because I'm a reckless and a bad manager, I would have to in fact bring my wife into it. So, and seriously, the contractual agreement said, if you bring Dee in it, we'll allow you to set up Da Vinci. So she had to give it up. But the point about this is, there's a lot of evidence now about the notion of entropy in organizations. And what Beans did was that they measured about 200 companies. And what they showed, now let me just explain to you, to the layman. Low entropy means high energy, and high entropy means low energy. Okay. So here you've got at low entropy, you get very high engagement of people. And so entropy is seen to be a critical measurement within organizations. And I'm parking that because it'll become more evident later why I brought this up. We also at Da Vinci did quite a lot of work on networks of convergence. We were really interested to see how things were starting to emerge post the 27th of April 1994. Things were starting to happen, and there's quite a lot of work that I've done on it, but I just thought I would highlight a thing. So I asked the question, what have these 3 things got in common? The downfall of apartheid, the onslaught of xenophobia, and the cell phone mania. The downfall of apartheid, all of a sudden things started to disintegrate. You started to see the walls being painted with a mandla. Things started to happen. Benches started to, in fact, be occupied by black people, which were normally white people. It was out of the control of the nationalist government. The onslaught of xenophobia, what happened that sparked that off in this country? Nobody really understood it. And then the work that we did at Da Vinci on the cell phone mania was crazy. If you look at the original business plan for both MTN and Vodacom, they predicted that the saturation rate of cell phones in South Africa would be 8 million. They built their models around. Go and have a look at the original business plans way back. And of course, today, I think the saturation, it's over 50 million cell phone connections in South Africa. And the point about all of this is, in fact, that they have a very, very interesting characteristic, and that is the growth of an epidemic. And so we then started to say, let's start look at this concept of what we call social epidemics. And of course, you must go to Malcolm Gladwell, and Gladwell tells us about the fact that there are 3 characteristics of an epidemic, or social epidemic. The first is this notion of contagiousness. Things start, it's contagious. The second thing is that little causes have big effects. And if you read his book, The Tipping Point, you will see some amazing characteristics there. And the third one is that, in fact, change does not happen gradually, but at one dramatic moment, and that's what he called the tipping point. And why I wanted to bring this up is because this is quite an important part of our model, but more importantly, I want you to think about what's happening in the world, because there's some really interesting things about the growth of this social epidemic. It's very, very fascinating if you study what's happening to Trump, and more importantly, from a South African point of view, you talk about what's happening here. So in the work that we did on these, on the convergence work, we started to ask ourselves questions about that are epidemics beyond the predictive capability of leaders. And why this is important is that those of us that were on the International Marketing Council way back in 2009, getting prepared for the 2010 World Cup, there was a serious concern as why South Africa wasn't getting excited about the World Cup. And what we thought is, how could we create an epidemic to get South Africa pumped up and really getting excited about the World Cup? The other point was, in fact, is it possible to engineer this social epidemic? And the other concern is that once you reach the tipping point, is it possible to control the fallout? So the notion was that, could you actually turn around and say, we want to create a social epidemic, but in fact, are there dangers associated with this? And what we say is that systems thinking can, in fact, provide some very interesting answers to some of these key questions, and hopefully you will see as we go along that this is quite an interesting concept. Also in the world of complexity, we talk about complex adaptive systems, and what is interesting about complex adaptive systems is that this is work being done by a lot of highly sophisticated mathematicians who are trying to get to understand things like galaxies, ecologies, the markets, social systems, because what is happening is that they're virtually, the weather. And so they've played around with these things, and they've defined what they call the edge of chaos. And this edge of chaos really is, in fact, the border between an organization kind of thriving and an organization, in fact, almost dying. And what we see that there are three kind of important features of it. The one is the autonomous agents. The notion of when you look at a flock of birds or a swarm of bees, what happens, in fact, is that the actual participants can make choices about how to act. The second characteristic is what we call a network structure. They share some common rules. Very important. And the third one is that it's full of novelty. There's all the time this experimentation, looking for something new, looking for something different. What can we do in that particular environment? And I think one of the most interesting things with all the characteristics of this concept of the edge of chaos, the one that gives one a lot of heart is, in fact, it's where even the most entrenched old guard will eventually be overthrown. And so you will see why we get excited about what's happening and what's tracking in South Africa. Now, when we revisited Zandi's model, he made this tacit assumption that if you had these three states of the system and you went and you actually designed, there was a tacit assumption that inherent in this model, the leader who was going to take you to the as it should be state was, in fact, a systems thinker. The leader had to, in fact, be what we call a transformational leader. And this then led us to say that there's a serious deficiency in this model. And, the notion in South Africa could never be like Zimbabwe. We thought, well, let's invent a fourth state of the system, and that is the state of the as it could be. And we started to look at Zimbabwe, for example, and say, what happened after the 18th of April, 1980? This great joy and, the unbelievable excitement of Zimbabwe getting its independence. And what we realized, in fact, is that this is as a result of transactional leadership. You will do it my way, and there's no other way. And if you don't do it my way, I'm going to sort you out. And inherent in these two is that in the transactional one, you are plagued with unintended consequences. And every single day now in South Africa, almost every single day, you've got these unintended consequences. They are happening all the time. What happens tomorrow as a result of Brian Malefi being reinstated as your boss, or the boss of Etsi, not your boss, you, Jay? You're on the right side of the and we say that in this top here, this willingness and ability to reform. And so we talk about in this fourth state of the system, this tipping point. You can either tip upwards or you tip downwards. And what we'd like to suggest to you is that from a systems point of view and a complex point of view, we talk about that being the edge of chaos. So enough of the complexity area. The other area that we think is very, very interesting and very exciting is this notion of wicked problems. And it's so interesting that this work was started right in the 1970s, and where you saw Rittel and Weber publish the first evidence of what they called wicked problems. And once again, wicked problems is a huge amount of work being done. But organizations are using it. Iron used it very interestingly at UJ. And what we say is the characteristics of a wicked problem is it has no stopping rules. Solutions are not true or false, but better or worse. And to some of the people, this is not easy to grasp. you don't understand the problem until you've developed a solution, although we have a slightly different view about that. And then finally, the planner has no right to be wrong. And I think that this last one is critically important, that nowadays in an unforgiving world where the communications are so incredibly interlinked, the planner can't be wrong. And so we think that this concept of wicked problems is a very important one. But the point about it is, how do you deal with wicked problems? And what we suggest to you is that, the work that Ackhoff did, he said, you can never solve a wicked problem. You can only dissolve it. And the way that you dissolve it is, in fact, by redesigning the system. And what he said, and what we agreed with up until that stage, or up until recently, is that the redesign can only take place if you understand the concept of social systems. Now, why is this important? Because the first time I attended a lecture on systems thinking at Wits, the professor stood up and he said, let me try and explain to you about a system. Think about the human body. If you walk outside this room and you go down the stairs and you trip and you sprain your left ankle, all of a sudden your body will in fact self-organize and it will put more weight on the right side to relieve the pain. And he said, this is how you understand it. It has this self-organizing characteristic. The interesting thing about this is that in a social system, we say that in fact the players can exhibit choices. Just think about the latest issue in the United States of America, where Trump firmly believed that every member of the Republican Party was going to vote for his new health care bill. And yet, people decided not to do it because they can exhibit choices. Whereas as I stand over here, what I would call a biological system, my heart can't decide that it wants to be alive. So the fundamental difference between our form of social systems thinking and the classical form of systems thinking is that the players can, in fact, exhibit choices. And critically important is that if you're going to go down this route, you have to go for a fundamental change in mindset. And just to reinforce this other issue, which we thought is an important factor, is this notion of unintended consequences. And the work that's been done by these guys, Bob Norton is very changed and says, most of these unintended consequences come as a result of political decisions. And I think it's quite important. So we then decided, look, let's be cheeky. Let's have a go at a new model. So we spoke to you originally about entropy, and we said that low entropy, high energy, and we suggest that it's up there in order. We took the work from Snowden, where he speaks about disorder, and then we said, let's have a look at the concept of an open and a closed system. And because everybody who knows me from Da Vinci, I love S-curves, I said, I'm going to try and build an S-curve. This is my first attempt ever at a model for systems thinking. And I said, my starting point is the edge of chaos. From complex adaptive systems, either the system can verge into complete chaos, or in fact, the system can move and you can get some interesting concepts. And I already told you about this concept of emerging properties. And I'm part of a group of people at the George campus of NMMU. We had an interesting debate with them the other day. I love this concept of resilience. I see Benny on one of the things here, Da Vinci, you're talking about resilience. And you'll see later on why I think resilience is far more prominent than the notion of sustainability. On the other side, we have what we call far from equilibrium, and then in fact, eventually, it gets to a stage where the system becomes irreversible. And I want you to think about these concepts because they are going to become more and more pertinent as I move along this journey. And so we say that at the edge of chaos, you either go for this rigidity, that transactional form of leadership, and the system disintegrates, or you encourage disequilibrium. Why is a leader of a successful organization all the time making their people feel uncomfortable? And so we have to actually come to the point and say, it's like getting used to a completely different concept. Disequilibrium is in fact what we actually need, and we need to encourage it. So we put that on there, and then we said, there's an important thing that we can't ignore wicked problems. But in this domain over here, in the disintegration domain, we say that in fact there's a combination of wicked problems and social complexity. Here you've got really, really major complex issues taking place in terms of people interaction. And on the other side over here, where this capacity to grow and learn and evolve, you've got wicked problems. We don't deny that wicked problems are there. And so we say that on the sort of disintegrated side, it's incapable of adaptable evolution. So to try and test this model against models that actually work, we then thought, let's start looking at both Stacey and Snowden. And Stacey and Snowden speak about chaos. So we said, well, let's add chaos to this model, and let's superimpose Snowden, 4 domains, and let's also put in there Stacey's model, and his zone 5 was at the edge of chaos. And this kind of gave us quite a level of comfort that this new sigmoid curve, which really starts looking at 2 important, we think, parameters, the notion of entropy and the notion of an open and closed system, there might be something that's coming out of this, and we need to go, in fact, further along. I think the other important thing that to really talk about is the journey that we've been through, and that is on what we call systemic design thinking. And the notion about systemic design thinking, as Akov spoke about many, many years ago, how do we solve, dissolve wicked problems? And once again, just to really just reinforce this concept of a mindset change, what we say is, in fact, that business schools talk about inductive thinking. They are interested on directly observable facts. And design schools are all about abductive thinking or imagining, really saying what could be possible. And so what we find, of course, is that Einstein told us a long time ago that imagination is more important than knowledge. And so if we just do a high-level summary of the work or the process of the work that was established here at Da Vinci on systemic design thinking, and we don't ignore that we did a lot of work with the guys at Wharton. However, we think that we've taken it to a next stage, and it is interesting that when I saw Zandi not so long ago, we started to show him this work, and he just said, yeah, there's, like, for example, the introduction of the 4th state of the system, was very, very excited about it. So we run this process as a parallel process, and the one part of this parallel process is the mess formulation. What, in fact, is happening in the organization that would eventually destroy itself? And what we hope to get out of the mess formulation is this factual view of the current reality. You cannot turn around and say, everybody in South Africa is unhappy, unless, in fact, you do a proper survey. Or everybody in my business is absolutely happy unless you do a proper survey. Or, in fact, we will never achieve that profit expectation of the board unless you actually have hard, concrete facts. So the mess formulation is unambiguous, it's verifiable, and it's critically important. The second component of this is the ideal design. And this is the one that's extremely difficult for people to handle. We say, the organization that you know now, a bomb hit the head office, it no longer exists. And what happens here is you try to, in fact, create a realistic option for the future. So if you put this all together, we have a mess formulation team, an idealized design team, working in parallel with each other. And why is this important? Because it moves away from the traditional concept of strategy development, where the whole team will sit down and say, what's happening now, what's our current reality, and now let's, in fact, put in, when a person actually comes up with a SWOT analysis, I feel ill, I want to actually, bring up in my filing basket. Because SWOT analysis is just so incredibly, naive perception, because you always think that you are so good, so it gives you such a distorted view. So what happens is that this mess formulation team works completely independently of the ideal design team, and they actually go on this journey together. And when they are ready, they bring the two together. The mess formulation team produces its observations about the current reality, and the ideal design team says, here's a model, and they see whether, in fact, the mess team, the ideal design actually dissolves all the problems that are in the mess. And then it gets taken to the board, the boss. In the case of Iron, it was taken to him at UJ, and they decide whether, in fact, what the team has come up with might have to be tweaked, whatever the story is. And once, in fact, there's agreement, you go through the migration. How are you going to move from where you are now to where, in fact, this ideal design takes you to? And there are a whole lot of very exciting examples about how this has worked. Because what happens here is that there's all this time this curiosity concept, once again talking about the Da Vincian principles. An important part of this work that we've done on systemic design thinking is to constantly remind the players that you have to be critically aware of your stakeholder grouping. And we talk about the internal groupings, the operating environment. Understand what's happening in your own organization, your structure, your culture, your resources, your values, all of those good things. In the second environment, which is the transaction environment, don't underestimate those key organizations that are sitting outside of your organization who you might have absolutely no influence over, but in fact they have a direct impact on your business. So in higher education, Benny and Iron, whether they like it or not, the Department of Higher Education and Training will be sitting there because they are required by law to meet those requirements. And right outside of it is what we call the contextual environment, and this is where macro things happen. Changes in technology, new infrastructure, new high-speed data systems, changes in legislation, changes in judicial issues and all those things. So all the time, you have to take this into consideration, whether you're looking at the mess or you're looking at the ideal. And the new model that emerges must, in fact, find a way to accommodate all three of these environments. So I've been playing around with a software package. Where's Donna? Yeah. Called Flying Logic. She and I have had quite a lot, and I apologize, you won't be able to see this. But about 9 months ago, we started to map South Africa. And Flying Logic is quite an interesting software package because it allows you to create a whole lot of very interesting connections. And what we started to do with Flying Logic is we started to put a whole lot, and I'm going to show you a bit more detail, and whatever comes out in red are these wicked problems. So this is a map of South Africa. We started to map South Africa as we saw it at least 9 months ago. And if you have a closer look at it, you will see things that happen, for example, operational inefficiencies, failing health services, bloated public service, the tripartite alliance, downfall of COSATU. I was in a meeting yesterday. The predictions are that by this time next year, COSATU will no longer be there. So all of these things come into this model, and data and bandwidth costs, no trust, lost opportunities, and all of those good things. But what's interesting is that we identified junk status, and we said that as our model of systems thinking, we will have to go to junk status. And what's also interesting was this Africa Spring. The notion that, in fact, you are now involved in an environment where things are actually sorted out over a telephone. Have a look at the issues that take place at universities. The Vice Chancellor of UJ gets informed at 3 o'clock in the afternoon that there's going to be a mass meeting outside the gates of UJ. And sure as nuts, by 5 o'clock, there are hundreds of students over there. Just cell phones. And the Africa Spring kind of starts emulating the Arab Spring, where you actually brought down countries. So we think it's got very, very interesting opportunities. This. So the bottom line of our version of systemic design thinking really says to the leader, involve the total organization. And really what Lao Tzu said, go to the people, live with them, and at the end of the day, we have done this ourselves. We tell the story about how we walked into a listed company in South Africa, and the chief executive said, who should be part of the systems and design thinking unit? And we said, when we walked into your reception, that lady who welcomed us. What the bloody hell does she know? Well, let me tell you something. She was brought into this thing. She knew more about the business than the chief executive did, and many of the executive directors. But can you imagine, she went home that night, and she said, instead of this company going for the 3-day Bosparat and getting drunk and having game drives and stuff like that, I have been brought in to help redesign the future of this organization. The psychological impact that it had. He will tell you, the Vice Chancellor UJ will tell you what happened when he allowed his people, a whole group of people, to get involved in this process. They took ownership. And so when you open the literature, or you go onto the internet and you look at design thinking, the most dominant thing will be IDEO. IDEO is a product development company. And IDEO were the guys that developed the computer mouse. And they turned around and said, we are so good at developing products, why don't we go and help organizations using the same design methodology to redesign their organizations? But they will go to the chief executive of the organization and say, what do you want? He says, I want to double my bottom line profits in 5 years' time. They say, well, we will redesign the organization to do that. Our notion is, in fact, that we look at the organizational system. We start off with no preconceived ideas. You cannot go to the chief executive in our system and say, what's your dream? Because he doesn't really know what the problem is. And the process actually starts bringing out problems, which is just absolutely miraculous. And I will say to you now, probably over the last 10 years, we've done 30 to 40 major projects. We've had one failure. And Mr. Dean, the failure was because of a group of engineers. And he and I always have a go at each other because engineers think they are systems thinkers. They are systemic thinkers. They can't think systemically. Systematically, they can only think systematically. Sorry. So what we try to show here is that design thinking is not for the faint-hearted. And it's so interesting. There are only two types of organizations that will come to us to do this work. Ones that are doing incredibly well and want to do better, and others who've tried every trick in the book. And in fact, now say, yeah, I'll come and do this with you. I've got no other option. So it's very, very interesting. So when we went and we started to say to ourselves, what have we done in systems and design thinking over the years? And we wanted to look at our interventions. And we said, let's look at the range of applications. And they are diverse. We have done NGOs. We've done universities. We've done large organizations, small organizations. We have done an opera company, wildlife trusts. And in every organization, except one engineering organization, it's worked like a dream. There is a PhD student here at Da Vinci who went and, in fact, followed 8 organizations that we did the work in. And we said, she went and, in fact, said, what happened when the Da Vinci team moved out from your organization? Was there any sustainability? So the good news was that all 8 of them, thank goodness, said it had a profound impact on the organization. But they felt that you had to go back, that the team would have to go back there to actually reignite, to get things going. And, we said to ourselves, have we actually moved from a solution to a problem? What's happened in those organizations? And she will publish her work fairly soon, and it is actually looking quite interesting. The next question we asked ourselves is, how does this model cope with the future? When you talk about Zuma, you talk about Trump, you talk about Brexit, we could have also put there the French general election. These are things, if we'd all sat down in a coffee shop, we could have taken bets on Trump, we could have taken bets on Brexit, and we would have all been wrong. If you have a look at the polls, they were all fundamentally wrong on all of those scores. So we said we better go back and relook at this model and see whether, in fact, this model gives us any insight into what's going on. So there's a serious question about what happens here. And there's another more serious question about what happens in that domain where, in fact, there's disintegration. And so, as you know, in S-curves, all good leaders will, if they manage their organization, S-curves say, when we get to this point over here, we should already start generating what we call our second S-curve. And so we said to ourselves, so how does this work? Because it's not like developing a product or a new offering from a university or anything like that. It's all about trying to actually see from a social systems point of view what is required to generate that second S-curve. And so we then went into this concept, into this world of autopoiesis. And autopoiesis really was a whole interesting study around nature, and then a group of people went and turned around and said, can you take the work on autopoiesis and actually bring it into organizations? And Dimitrov and Fell have done some fascinating work. And let me just tell you that the important characteristic of an autopoietic system is, in fact, it's a system that reproduces itself from within itself. So if you look at nature, plants grow, they lose their leaves, they come back again. So it's this kind of self-generation. They reorganize themselves. And what they've done is, they in fact said, let's link the fundamental principles of nature to organizations. And the first thing that they talk about is this notion of the sensitivity to initial conditions. The concept of the butterfly flapping its wings in Tokyo, causing a tornado in Texas. All the work that the chaos theory people have done. The second thing is it brings about the concept of a strange attractor. And I'm not going to emphasize it here because I've got quite a lot of work. I want to show you a bit more on strange attractions. Obviously, it talks about nonlinear dynamics. There's no linear cause and effect relationships. It also talks about the concept of a fractal structure, the fundamental building blocks of an organization. And fortunately for us, in our model, it also talks about the edge of chaos. The different, do you swing over to the wrong side or to the right side? And then finally, it talks about the self-organizing characteristic. Remember, I spoke to you about the fact that the organization actually starts self-organizing itself, and the structure starts fitting the situation. So here's an interesting concept, that it is only kind of what probably in about the last 15, 18 years with the advent of fairly sophisticated computers, that you could take a pendulum and just actually allow it to swing at a complete random way. And it starts generating something very interesting. And so it depends on where you start this pendulum, will in fact define what this pattern is going to look like. So the first thing that we find out, in fact, is that this chaotic movement has shape. Very important. Secondly, there's this shape where they define as what they call the strange attractor, and there's some order. There's some inherent order in this thing. This is not completely chaotic. The third thing is that, in fact, it talks about whether the system will move either positively or negatively. It talks about the edge of chaos. The fourth thing is, in fact, the strange attractor comes in, but it respects boundaries. This thing never exceeds those boundaries. And finally, what we say is that the strange attractor will catalyze the system, and once again reinforces this notion of fractals, which I'm going to come up with again later on. Now, I always say a sad thing in this ruthless world of academia is that we always think the work that we do is so much better than others. But there's a lady by the name of Margaret Wheatley, who many years ago started to take this world of the confused world of chaos theory, and many of us could never understand because it was highly mathematical, and try and bring it to something that was actually digestible for businesses and for organizations. And basically, she spoke about two things. She spoke about this notion of fractals and fractal quality, and she also spoke about the concept of strange attractor and the concept of a strange attractor of meaning. And what she said about fractals were these are the fundamental building blocks. If you go into an organization and it has what she defined as a fractal quality, it doesn't matter whether you go in and you go to the kitchen here or you go to Benny Anderson. You will want to, in fact, believe that an organization has a fractal quality. You can pervade the organization anywhere you want to. The same ethos, the same value system pervades throughout the organization. On the other side, with the strange attractor, when everything starts to collapse, a strange attractor comes into place. And it's so interesting in the work that she did, is that people start running away. But there's always a small group of people who stay behind, who have some semblance of kind of vision of the future. And that's what she spoke about. Some had checked out and others have stayed there, and that creates what she called an organization of meaning. Now, if we look at our model, we suggest to you that the fractals and the fractal quality sits over here in this area of disequilibrium. I want to promote this fractal quality through my organization, but I have to do it by constantly re-energizing the system. On the other side, when the strange attractor comes in, it comes in because the organization is disintegrating. Just to show you about strange attractors, about fractals, if I have this simple kind of tick there, it's not an academic gone wrong, it drank too much tonight and sort of ticking a script or something like that. But if I put another tick on top of it and more ticks on top of it, and I carry on putting ticks on top of it, eventually I get a third. And what they show you, in fact, is that this is this absolute beautiful notion. Because every single one of these things is that tick. And it suggests to us that when you want to manage your organization, those fundamental building blocks, it's that brick. You see this beautiful cathedral, but basically there's a brick. It's the same brick that actually builds that beautiful cathedral. And that's what we try to do. And what we talk about is the self-organizing characteristic, because all the time you are building on these building blocks, these fundamental fractals. The other point about this model that we're talking about is that when you actually subject an organization to high levels of stress, they let go of their present situation. And I think, once again, I want you to keep on thinking about what's happening in South Africa. And there are two things that happen. Either the organization dies, or in fact the organization, in fact, reorganizes itself and it actually goes into true transformation. And another important thing about transformation, which Wheatley said to us, in fact, he said, you can only have true transformation when, in fact, there's chaos there. Because people have to let go of their present concept of reality. So, how do we take all of this now and try and see what we can do with going to generate that second S-curve? So we revisited the autopoietic notion of social systems. And what we find is that in the work that these people did, they actually started to talk about the fact that in these social systems, the way that you do it is, in fact, it's through communications. So what happens, in fact, is that you reproduce things through the reproduction of communications. And they speak about 3 levels of this. The information, in fact, what is being communicated. The second one is utterances. How and why is something being communicated? And thirdly, critically important, the listener will decide what the meaning of that message is. And we suggest to you that this form of communication and organization is all around values. How do you communicate values in an organization? So we got very excited about whether there is some work being done on values. Because, you know, we all go and we do our strategic planning exercise and everybody says, what's your vision and your mission and your values? And what do we talk about? We talk about transparency, we talk about integrity, we talk about openness and honesty. And in fact, that's not going to satisfy this particular model. So we looked at the work done by Dolan and his colleagues, and he says to us, or they said to us, that the 21st century organization will no longer manage by objectives or manage by instruction. And their work talks about managing by values, the MBV. And they show a very, very interesting concept around what you need to do to create a value base in the organization. And they suggest that the values, in fact, actually dictate the behavior and conduct. And so we try and create an organization that actually develops and shares these values, and this is very important. And so how do you build these values within the organization? And what they showed us was it's way beyond the kind of values that we understand. And they have a whole variety of values which have different meanings within the organization. So you get this whole concept of values, where there are control values and development values and ethical values, which we know about. And so they've got this plethora of values which they think is very important. So if we go back to our model and we say to ourselves, so let's go and try and answer this question about what happens over here. So we say that if you don't re-energize or reintegrate, constantly reinvigorate, what will happen is that in fact the organization will disintegrate. And this is so sad because this happens all the time. So that's an important concept. We also say over here that when you start disintegrating, remember I spoke to you about the strange attractor, that as the organization disintegrates, a strange attractor comes into play. And we say to you, or suggest to you, that a new complex system starts developing in that particular environment. And we said, we argue now that what happens over there is because it's a collapse of a value system. You can't help but say, what has happened in the ANC, a 104, 105-year-old organization, deeply entrenched values. And now you say to yourselves, what's happening? Very, very, very concerning at all, indeed. And over here, where you have this vigorous re-energization, it's all around, in fact, actually keeping that value system alive. So we plotted order or entropy against open and closed systems. But are we ever going to be able to actually plot where an organization sits in this particular SQ? And what the good news is that there's been work done by Lee Stubbs, where he shows now that you can actually measure the openness of an organization. And if we go to the work that Dee and her colleagues did and what other people have done more recently, and you can actually start building a model for an organization around entropy, and it has a whole range of important parameters that you need to measure in the organization. So we are now feeling pretty bucked with ourselves, that you can actually now go back and you can actually come and start saying, by measuring the entropy and the openness of the organization, you can actually start saying, where do you sit in this thing? And what are the indicators that you have to actually warn a leader? Are you actually moving towards the complete state of disintegration, or are you over here, and what should you do? I titled the slide Biomimicry, and I've got really excited about the work that's been done. I know Benny's been dabbling with some people. There's some incredibly interesting work being done in Neisner on biomimicry. But I wanted to sort of try and give you an insight into where we think this is all going. And what Einstein said is look deep into nature and you shall find the answers. I mean, it's always profound that if you actually pick this stuff up. We think we're great, but in fact, he thought about it, a hell of a long time ago, really hell of a long time ago. And so if I actually look at the journey that we've been on, we started off with Zandy and Akov. Benny and Dee and I got involved with the South African Bureau of Standards when Bonnie Meshmakulu took over the SABS. She just turned and said, I don't know what to do. She had heard about us. We brought Pudina out to South Africa, and we redesigned with them, or they redesigned the South African Bureau of Standards. And so we went on. We've done work for the Australian government, Western Australian government. We've done a lot of work in the United States of America. Benny, Dee and I went to Germany. We've done lots of companies in South Africa. We've done massive amount of work in Germany. But something happened to us, like not more than, 4 months ago. We were called in by the mayor of Knysna. And she said to us, she's got a major challenge. So Knysna municipality, it's a Mickey Mouse municipality. I mean, it's small, but very interesting. Tip between DA and ANC, and serious challenges. Running out of water, massive population problems and all that. And we started to work with them. And the mayor is an amazing woman, absolutely courageous, phenomenal, gutsy, doesn't take any nonsense, and really impressive. And the biggest wake-up call, because we walked in there with this notion that we firmly believed that the only important thing was that when you look at this organization, it's all around people. And so we actually constantly reinforce the notion of social systems. That's the only thing that's important. And what happened, in fact, is that we worked together with the Sustainability Research Unit at George and the Knysna municipality, and the big wake-up call was, in fact, you focus on the social system that you're carrying. There are other components to the system which you have to start looking at, and we'll try and explain that to you. So there was a disconnect in the work that we did. So how do we try and persuade you that, in fact, moving away from only thinking that social systems are important to something else, is we said, let's go and visit the triple bottom line. All listed companies in South Africa are required to report on the triple bottom line, where they look at the economic issues, the environmental issues, and the social issues, and where you have the various interfaces, the viable, the equitable, and the bearable. And what they say to us is that all organizations must demonstrate that you're placing equal emphasis on all of those things. And if you do it, by the way, you'll have a sustainable organization. And we said, maybe this doesn't really satisfy our particular needs. So we said, let's look at the triple bottom line, but change 2 things. One was talk about ecological and move away from the notion of sustainability to resilience. Because we think that resilience is a fundamentally important thing. And we got excited about this because ecology talks about relationships and interactions of living systems. So we suggested that there's a slightly different modified version of this triple bottom line, and then said, well, let's go back and see what we've got. So the first thing is, why do we get excited about resilience? Because it's the ability to withstand unpredictable shocks. You now have to understand that that's what we're all about. This complex world that we're in, there are unpredictable shocks. It's those wicked problems. How are leaders going to constantly be aware that all the time from the left curve and the right curve, different things are happening to you which are way beyond your prediction. So when we start off and we talk about our work, probably in the corporate world you can talk about social systems. Maybe in the political world you can talk about social and economic systems. But in the world that we're working in now, we suggest to you that it's the concept of C, social, ecological, and economic. And our challenge now is, how do we actually take the work that we've done on design thinking and introduce these 2 E's into it? And maybe there is something that we can learn from nature's principles. Because what nature's principles starts doing for us, it helps us to actually try and get some handle on this concept of uncertainty and volatility. And those of you who read Harvard Business Review will know that not so long ago, they actually published an article, what they called VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And they suggest that when you start looking at designing your organization for meeting the sort of complexities of the 21st century, you better have a look at this concept of VUCA. So, let's talk about biomimicry. So here's just wonderful stuff that's happened. Design of a hammer using the woodpecker. I get confused with the birds. This is, it's not the hoopoo, kingfisher. So you all know the story about the bullet train in Japan, the first trial run, they burst people's eardrums and all of that. They went and modeled the nose of it with the beak of the bird. The gecko and the training shoes with grips. And of course, the most famous first kind of biomimicry was Velcro. So here is a huge amount of work being done saying, can we emulate what's taking place in nature? Of course, the most fascinating thing is Kevlar. That in spite of that it's the strongest man-made material, it's not as strong as a spider's web. It's just really kind of interesting. It kind of defies, or it brings us back to life. So more recently, Hutchins has just produced a book where he talks about nature's business principles, and he has isolated some key things. He said, in nature, if you want to learn things, it's values-led. It's systems-based. It's adaptive. It's optimizing. It talks about resilience. And it talks about life supporting. And his whole book starts actually trying to persuade business and political leaders that maybe there's something really that you should take out of this world. So if you actually go and look at some of this work, what he says over here is that the firm of the future, you must start being inspired by nature. And the first thing is, it's about that fractal quality, which I spoke to you about weekly, the fundamental building blocks. The second thing is, he says, it's less about control and more about letting go. And I think we've got to, I mean, there are some models in South Africa that we've got to look at. UJ is a classic model. What has happened in 11 years? To produce a university that this year will in fact has got a higher research output than Stellenbosch. It was meant to die on the 1st of January 2005. What is it? You know, is it about control? Is it about letting go? Is it a balance between those things? The other thing is, it's less about prescriptive protocols and more about descriptive dynamic cyclic processes. All the time, this concept of changing and changing and changing. And finally, it's less about solving problems and more about working towards positive outcomes. And so what Giles came out with, he said, the classic kind of hierarchical structure no longer applies. Don't think you can go for some form of compromise. Because in nature, it's this huge, complex connectivity that is taking place. And this is what we need to learn. So if we go and we say we're pretty comfortable about what's happening, but we've never really explained what happens there. Does the ANC die? Does South Africa die? Does Trump die? Does whatever happens? Does Eskom die? You know, what is the story? And we sat and we said, God, this is worrying us, because we came out with this concept and say, there's a new complex system. Remember, we said it was a strange attractor that came in. It brings about a very, very new thing. And we then found some really interesting work done by these guys, Gunderson and Holling, which they called Panarchy Adapter Cycle. And what they show us is that when you get to that stage, you can now start seeing some interesting things happening. The first thing that happens, it's collapsed. And then they define what they call the backward loop, a rapid phase of reorganization and renewal. So that's the reorganization and renewal. Then, of course, you start growing, and eventually you get to what they call conservation. And this is the front loop. The front loop is slow, it's incremental. It takes time. It takes years to get to that stage. But what is exciting is that this has given us a lot of confidence that we can, in fact, find a reason to actually explain what could happen if an organization is about to die. With that meaning, the few people that were left there, they can, in fact, start through this Panarchy adaptive cycle, give us some ideas about regenerating the organization. And once again, just a wonderful experience that we had early this year. We were called in to go to an organization called Naturally Knysna. Now, if you have a look, Knysna has won for many, many years the work that they do on tourism. It is phenomenal. It is absolutely phenomenal. And between the city council and the private organizations that are all involved in tourism, they formed an organization called Naturally Knysna. And it tracked our model beautifully. Naturally Knysna started to collapse and disintegrate. The internecine cannibalism that was taking place there was absolutely frightening. And they heard about us through the mayor of Knysna, and they called us in and they said, you've got to come and work with us. So we went in there, and we started the work on with systems and design thinking. D took a whole group of these people, 50 of them, and went and did the mess formulation. I took a whole group of them, about 50 of them, and started to work on an ideal design. And we were getting nowhere. I mean, it was, because it's mainly volunteers. They get a grant of a couple of million rand from the Knysna municipality. It was horrific. And what happened? I'm not joking. At the 11th hour, an interesting man appeared. He wasn't meant to be there. And he just got up and he said, this is the way we're going to go. And he actually catalyzed that group of people in ideal design. And no, I'm not exaggerating. In the last 6 weeks, they have redesigned Naturally Knysna. This model track, he wasn't meant to be there. He's not even part of that environment. He's just there because he's a citizen of Knysna. And he took it upon himself and he said, we're going to do this. So when the organization is, and tragedy should never ever collapse because it's doing wonderful work in that environment. And it actually worked fantastically. So if we now go and say to ourselves, well, we've placed, let's go and look at this issue about values. And we said to you that in this particular environment, where in fact the organization disintegrates, we said to you that it's a collapse of the value system. And it's so interesting. Nike nearly died. It was discovered that they were using child labor to manufacture their shoes. Their value system was rotten. They had to redesign themselves. Interesting, Nokia. What the hell did Nokia think that they could continue to believe that they're the best cell phone company when Apple and Samsung came in? And of course, you've heard now that Nokia and Surab and I were in Finland in December last year. It's fascinating. But they've had to regenerate themselves. They've nearly died. Nearly died. And then, of course, I asked the question, what's going to happen to this? Now, some people believe that the strange attractor is going to come in. Who's the strange attractor? What's going to happen? If I have a look over here and I say to myself, well, what happens over here? There are wonderful organizations. John Lewis, Panasonic, Adnams, Virgin, and the challenge to Iron Rensman. Write the book. Because this is what's happening. There's a value system. He challenges all of us around a set of values. And I can't escape that reality. If you look at Virgin, I mean, people think he's a dog. He's not. There's a deeply entrenched set of values in the organization. And so it's all about a dedication to define a core set of values and a sense of purpose greater than profitability alone. And we think that that is really, really exciting. And so let me come to the end and just say to you that it's been a wonderful journey. And I nearly burst into tears from emotion to see all of you here today. And just to say thank you very much for giving us this opportunity to take what we've done over 33 years and try and put it into something that suggests to you that maybe what is emerging over here is a model that could work. And maybe there are going to be some people here that are going to be inspired to come and do some work with us. And we're saying to ourselves that where do we sit now? The first thing is that we're going to have to move away from this entrenched concept that all we are concerned about is social systems and introduce the ecological and the economic part of it. We really believe that the flying logic process is the next stage. And I thank you, Dana, when you and I sat one day in Eskom and we started to say, you know, there must be a way of taking all these things and looking at the connections. And by the way, the flying logic, you can put values to it. So it can discount things that can actually put some real stuff in. We also say that, thank goodness, we can now start measuring entropy and openness, and therefore we can plot where an organization sits. And then finally, just to make our lives even more exciting, we've got excited about this concept of socio-ecological systems, or SES. And this really talks about the world of Eleanor Ostrom, where there is some really interesting stuff coming about. And I don't know, that's probably for the next inaugural lecture by some other professor, because that's a huge amount of work. And I don't know, but I think you've got to start looking at that if you're actually looking at where we are. So, what did Einstein say? The intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant. We've created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift. I hope I've inspired you. Thank you very much.
Roy, thank you very much. That was amazing. I'm opening the floor for questions.
Professor, I would like to ask about design. In practical terms, or in practice, it seems as if design has become less important in the way in which we work, in which our society works, in which our projects are being done. It's almost as if the agile thing, let's do as we go and see what happens, is more the way that it happens. And the whole systems thinking thing is the design is so core to it. And personally, I strongly believe that good design is timeless.
Yeah.
But in practice, I don't see that. And I was wondering if you see the same thing, especially in our country. It's as if we do things and see what happens. We don't design for outcomes that we want to see the end in mind. We almost sort of run a race, but we don't know where we're going.
Look, I think you're absolutely right, and I think that that's part of the problem. The problem is that part of this, the inherent in this design process, is you constantly test. If I'm going to do this, what's going to happen? We show in the work that we did here at Vinci the impact of the welfare system in this country. 17 million people on the welfare. But if you actually have a look at, there are elegant models of how to manage the welfare system. From Brazil, for example. But what we did is we said, we're going to do this. The consequences, the unintended consequences of the welfare system are frightening. And so the biggest part of the design that comes into this work is this notion of testing it against your stakeholders. What will happen if I pass this legislation? And so I think that you are absolutely right. What we are trying to do is to encourage you. It's what I said to Nelson Mandela. He never said, I'm going to do this. He stood back and he started to test it. And I think that's the most important part. When you ultimately come out with that design, you've got to go to the chief executives of organizations. Professor Anderson, here's my new design for Da Vinci. And you've got to be able to turn around and say, I've tested it against all concepts, all variations, and whatever can be done. So I agree with you. Absolutely agree with you.
Prof, just something I need to bring to everyone's attention is that people are now moving towards creating co-ops. And apparently the one in Cape Town, I think it's special. That whole municipality is run on a co-op basis, and it's working like a dream because they've gotten rid of this monster that we have, that the municipality is run by provincial government. It's not, but it's working efficiently. They're even running some farms outside of the Broncos where the whole community is involved. They're all part of it. But they're growing food, they're distributing food, they're getting income. And I think people are now starting to understand the concept of creating a close corporation as opposed to a company because people are all actively involved. And I think that would form part of a system base that would work.
Yeah, no, Rocco, there's a wonderful story of Akhoff. You know, I'm going to tell it very quickly. A man walks into Akhoff's office and he says, Professor, I don't know whether you know, but the University of Pennsylvania owns half of Philadelphia. I mean, like, seriously does. He's been, I mean, it's scary. But there's a bad slum area in Philadelphia, really bad. And he came in and he said, I've made an obscene amount of money by selling newspapers, generating newspaper for the slum area. And he says, I want to give back to the community. He said, I bought a piece of land. He says, I want to put up a basketball field. I want to put up a building. I want to put computers and all of those good things. He said, but I need you to help me design this whole facility. So Akhoff said to him, you're at the wrong place. He said, but you're the top business professor at Wharton. What do you mean I'm in the wrong place? He said, Akhoff said, I don't work like this. Who said this is what the community wants? So the guy said, what do you mean? Surely they're going to want computers. Surely they're going to want... He said, buddy, if you want me to work with you, bring the community. And they designed what they wanted. It is such a great success story that the gang leader gave up being a gangster and is now the leader of that community. And they designed what they wanted. They respect it. It's just created a nerve center there. And I think what you're seeing is that if you give people that opportunity and you don't as a leader decide what you think they want, you let them to actually design what they want, it works. And these informal things are happening. In some of the towns in Karoo, There are amazing things happening with these informal people getting out and say, I'm tired of the bureaucrats telling me what to do. Let's go and reorganize ourselves. And I think that that is exciting.
Yeah. Prof. Ben, I'll get to other people.
Yeah, I would just like to make a comment first and say, Roy, thank you very much for a very, very, very well thought through presentation. I also appreciate the reference to or the development from the 3-stage frame to the 4th stage. But I want to ask something in this regard. Do you have indicators that will preempt whether a system will tip to the should be or the could be? And I particularly want to ask it if we take into consideration that we're moving, hopefully, from a more collaborative engagement as society, where the network space was collaboration, to a more cooperative space. So it's becoming more about me as the individual knowledge worker. Now, if that on one end is happening, what do you anticipate will be the tipping point to the should be or the could be? And do you have maybe some indicators there?
Yeah, I mean, it's typical of Benny Anderson to ask the question. You wouldn't have expected anything less from him. I think the point is it's at the edge of chaos. And we are struggling with that. Because it's exactly that. What is going to define that tipping point? And how do you measure it? And we are suggesting that possibly you could plot it by measuring openness and entropy. But that's going to be difficult in communities because, how do you measure those things? So we are hoping to go back into Knysna then, and the mayor is very, very keen. And that is in fact going to give us a very, very exciting experimental base because it's highly complex and it is in fact exactly those environments are existing there. There's the formal stuff which clearly can't work, it can't sustain itself anymore. The town's going bankrupt. And there's the informal stuff. There's an amazing thing in Smutsville. Sorry to tell you the story. 2 retired people went to Smutsville. Now, Smutsville is a very poor area, part of Knysna municipality. And these 2 people came and they said, we've made a lot of money, we want to give something back to life. And they went into Smutsville and they just saw this place litter. The litter was horrific. So they started an organization which in fact operates today. Every Wednesday, the school children collect, well throughout the week they collect plastic bags, stuff in there. And they go and they actually get these plastic bags weighed. And they get points allocated. And there are 2 huge 12-meter containers. And in those 12-meter containers, anything from toilet brushes, toilet paper, toothpaste, bicycles, soccer balls, rugby balls. And each one of those things has got a value to it. It's so many kilograms. So if I'm a young kid and I want a bicycle, I will in fact collect enough waste on my scorecard to do this. Well, let me tell you something. You cannot believe it. I promise you now, you will not find a speck of waste. I mean, we travel through Smutsville. It's mind-blowing. And I think that this is what you're starting to see is the community. These kids are now completely motivated. And I think that that's what's starting to happen. It's gone beyond, because Knysna municipality said, we don't know how to collect the litter. And so I think it's that edge of chaos that's starting to happen.
So in a way you confirm that even in that context, social system, we already have a cooperative engagement.
Yeah, that is a total cooperative.
It's not because they are dependent socially on each other, they're cooperating towards a bigger goal.
Absolutely. And I think it came at the edge of chaos. There are those rules that those people were, but they are independent.
Yes.
They were autonomous.
Cooperative.
Yeah. But you're right. And I mean, I think that's the challenge. It's what I said. Could you engineer a social epidemic? And in fact, where do you know and how do you actually manage that edge of chaos or measure the edge of chaos? We sure have one to do.
Yeah, I was going to say, by the way, Roy, I think it was an excellent presentation. I loved some of the imagery and how the leaps emerged from mathematics. I thought that was a beautiful picture. But it seems that the way that we are training students traditionally, I think we take an approach of building depth first, and then we try to build breadth. But sometimes in the depth, it almost appears that the breadth is lost. You may have somebody that is specializing, say, in electrical engineering or in energy systems, but you may find that you've taught kilowatts, but you haven't taught kilowatts percent, and how it varies then in various areas, and how the social component and the political component needs to come in. So, in our faculty, we're trying to take a model of sustainable development because it brings about the various aspects of breadth. And I am interested in, there's the component of mesh, which I have punned in the past, as you remember, to mesh, because it almost appears that when we have a graduate, the graduate comes into this mesh, which is like a spider web, and sometimes gets stuck in one or the other area. So I would like to hear your comments about, I see that you've put now a spin into the sustainable development because you've brought in the component of continuous renewable or resilience.
Yeah.
And I think that, do you think that is perhaps, but it's hard to think, I think it's not only in a faculty, but it's in the composition of faculties of the university, referring both to people and the entities of the university. What would be your thinking about the notion of sustainable development as not necessarily a theme for a faculty, but even for an entity of a university to break the boundaries of that?
It's a lovely thought. Look, I think that, one would, I'm sure it's possible. It's possible at a 21st century university. It's definitely not possible at another, at sort of a hardcore, university that hasn't gone through experimentation. Old blue chip, yeah. But I do think that it would be a wonderfully exciting concept, because what do we talk about? We talk about, this cross-pollination, cross-fertilization. You've got an amazing project on aqua, where you've got people from all disciplines doing it. But is it really going to work? Has it been designed by the dean and other people? Has everybody been brought into it? And how could you actually create almost a reward system? The more informality, but in fact it actually starts working. But it means breaking down some serious boundaries. And of course, when we talk to business leaders, they say to us, but who am I going to hold accountable? And that's the problem. There has to be a chief of a faculty or a university. Somebody has to, in fact, hold accountable. But I think it's a lovely concept. I really do. Because this does lend itself. I mean, to be honest with you, if you did the work that we did at the state of Missouri, here's the classic example was the state of Missouri derives most of its income from agriculture. They do the survey. The average age of the farmers are 58 years old. The kids don't want to go and work in their father's farms. It's like, I don't want to be a farmer. And then Dee and I went and we worked with the states. They brought the universities in, they brought the agricultural experts in and all that, and they were able to redesign agriculture. That a kid now says, I can see a future for myself. But they needed high-speed connectivity and all of those good things. And so I do think it's possible, because the state of Missouri will in fact be able to continue to derive income from agriculture. It's redesign it. Redesign it.
But now can I just ask a follow-up on terms of that comment, Roy? Won't that also have, in terms of your concept of resilience and ecological engagement, I wonder how will that relate, depending on his comment, to the idea of revisiting the notion of disciplinary versus interdisciplinary versus transdisciplinary. Because in the transdisciplinary space, nobody needs to be equal.
And of course, we've had that discussion. Because, it's so interesting, when we went to Finland, he and I are ostensibly engineers, and we know you don't dare move away from EXA.
Yeah.
EXA tells you, you will have a 4-year degree, you will do this, you will do that. Well, it's interesting. Some of the Scandinavian countries, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? We actually create engineers. That lady, we were on where's Pat Naidu there? He was on the internet. There was a lady engineer who was the mayor's personal assistant. And she was given the task to redesign this area where Nokia headquarters are. Boy, if we could produce a graduate like that, I mean, she understood social systems, she understood everything. So there was no turn around and say, you're not allowed to move from this. And that's the problem. So the transdisciplinary thing, I think, it's the way to go. And it also gets back to some of the discussions that have been held. Is accreditation necessary? Do people want to go to, I mean, what's that American organization?
Yes.
Yeah. You don't get credits.
That's true. Shirley?
Well, I don't think it wasn't really a joke. It was a tongue-in-cheek statement. We know you're coming to DET. And you know the Department of Higher Education, and I'd like to say that I think our minister he lives in a schizophrenic world, very much, because as a hands-on education person, with a deep passion for the social problems, etc., he really wants to see change, etc. But on the other hand, we are driven as by policies and principles and things in bed, and I've had a big discussion about the bureaucrat. I'm a bureaucrat. I try and be a different kind of bureaucrat with ideation, etc. But would you think that part of the problem we have right now is exactly what Ben was talking about, that maybe in a collaborative sort of type of space, or in that tipping point space, collaboration always has some concept or notion of a senior partner in the collaboration. And that somehow the system needs to move more to a cooperative, and is that, would you, in this big system, taking note of the fact that our minister now, in the current space, overarchingly looks after everything to do with education, training, skills development, NSFAS, NSA, NSF, CETAs, universities, colleges, community college, you name it. It's in this massive everything. And this, I always think of that book, Things Fall Apart. And things are falling apart. And yet it's this sort of, everyone's trying to hold on. Would it not be that possibly one of the things from what I've seen, and I loved this, is that we're moving to a cooperative, to a resilience, to something, and how we do it.
So of course, what you've just reinforced is this notion that in systems thinking, if you think everything are these isolated watertight compartments, and you manage in that way.
Yes.
So we always tell the story when we go into a company and the chief executive says, the reason why I talk to you is because my sales are down. They say, what have you done? He says, I fired the sales director. And so what now? We've had 3 people since then and the sales are down. So nothing to do with the sales department. Your product's wrong, or your pricing's wrong, or whatever the story is. And what we've created a monster in higher education and training. And the tragedy is what's costing us. There's no continuity, there's nothing. So in the work that Ira and I were trying to persuade them to do is to say you cannot continue to actually amend the Act. So every time something goes wrong, we put another amendment, We're just bolting on more and more problems. And if you look at some of the research that people have done, when you tinker with a system that's broken, you just exacerbate the problem. So the real idea is to bring the whole pot together and say, and allow the players to redesign the system. Not when Dohet comes and says, this is what the new model is going to look like. We've appealed. Let the people, in fact, design the thing. I think there's huge hope for it. Huge hope.
Right, I like that. Any other questions?
Thank you so much for watching this study that took me about 10 years. And I'd like to say for supervising me to my master's, especially
I'm so excited.
My question today is around where do you place the individual or the person who actually starts of the design process? The leader who is either transformational or transactional leader. Let's put a name, Professor Mansberg. So, at what point does it bring the idea or spark the energy to change the situation for better? Does he design it for the people? Should it be something that is good for him as well, or do you separate the two?
Okay. So there are 2 important things. It's a very good question. Number 1, the leader has to have the courage to know that what's going to come out of this formulation is ugly. I mean, Dee and I were with one company where the chief executive lost it. Because he promised his shareholders an increase in profits, a continuous increase in profits. And the MES formulation said you're going to go bankrupt in 18 months' time. And because we said the MES is critically important because it's factual and it's verifiable. And he threw his cell phone. We're mad. So it's huge courage. You have to be courageous to do this because you're not going to like what you want. But the other important thing is, the leader in our system doesn't know what he wants. He knows that he wants to, in fact, he's going to allow his people to come back to him and suggest to him that here are ideas. And the third thing is, he's not allowed to be part of the process. Why? Because if you're sitting in a MES team or an ideal team with the leader, you're going to say, what does my boss want to do? So we don't allow him to be this. So.
That's better.
So annoying me. I didn't know what was going on. So the leader's not in the process, and that's why it works. But that's the problem. The problem is that there are not many leaders that are prepared to do it. Benny and I did it. Yeah, it's scary. I mean, do you want to know what happened to Vinci? I'll tell you the truth. When they came back, they designed DNI out of the system. We started this business. Our own people, that's how we left Da Vinci. We started Exit Da Vinci. Ask Benny. They came back and said, the future of Da Vinci is not you guys. Ask him. Let him tell you what he experienced.
Wow. Okay. Any other questions?
Yes, I'll
Yeah.
say Modete first.
The model, as I see it, is almost that you're looking to nurture chaos. But
Yes.
in light of the fact that these building blocks, the fractals that you describe, are almost immutable, they're standard.
Yeah.
You need a system where that you will embrace resilience, and the resilience is the capacity to bounce back, to self-regulate, and to find that equilibrium. It's almost, and it's just a comment from my side, that you need almost like a benign lack of discipline, indiscipline,
Yeah.
in order to drive the process. I don't know what
No,
you're
you're absolutely right. You are trying to create disequilibrium all the time. It flies against a perceived comfort zone that we have, but nature's in disequilibrium all the time. And you strive to, in fact, create that feeling of uncomfortability. And yes, you don't wait, the fundamental building blocks are there, but you look at how you're going to rearrange them, how, the cathedral had a steeple like that, maybe you want to have an arch sort of style. But you don't play around with that value system. I think that is, you hold that very, very dear. You really do.
Well, that's almost prescriptive in itself.
It is. And I'm not, this is not a free and easy. He doesn't sit there as the Vice Chancellor or the head of Da Vinci and say, it's lost, you go do what you want to do. There are ground rules, there are rules of engagement. But there is a sense of autonomy. Maybe he doesn't believe it as the Dean of the Faculty of Engineering, but I think he does. Because he's been allowed to do things. He can do things within the conscripts of that value system. And the value system is not just be open and honest, it has all those other parameters to it, and I think that's the important thing.
I think the benign discipline is still subscribing to the basic values,
Yes.
but still allowing that space to nurture the chaos.
Yeah.
I like the idea of the benign.
Yeah.
I really do, it's very nice. Very nice, thank you for that. We'll steal it. And I'll acknowledge it.
Ben?
Roy, I was just curious. So we work in organizations, and I hear you talking about the operating system, the three-layered system that is almost looking outwardly. But in a way, I wonder, you talk about values, but I wonder to what extent are you seeing a fourth layer moving to the other side? So where do I come from, as opposed to where am I going?
Yeah.
So where am I going is directed by my operating system and another meta system, eventually the contextual system. But to what extent should we consider where do I come from, as opposed to just where am I going?
Yeah.
If I look at even if I look at the systems currently, or the organizations, be it politically or organizations, workplaces, there's a lot of focus on how will we change what is around us. But I don't hear enough of where do we come from, where do we originate from,
Yeah.
what is the higher purpose, what is the why for being here, Even if I look at some of the political environments, I wonder if they would have asked that question, why are we? As opposed to where are we going?
I think in some of the work on non-governmental organizations where there's not this, more volunteering organizations, there is this, why are we here? So the work that we did on the birds in KwaZulu-Natal, the wattles, crane. Here was a group of people who had a serious concern about the wattle crane population. They asked, yes, they did. They said, this is where we're coming from. But I've not witnessed it in a more kind of formal environment. But it is interesting.
You don't.
And maybe it's something that you've got to do. And it's a very interesting concept.
One final question, maybe? Up there?
Prof. Roy, I was at an Invest Act function last night, and Trevor Manuel was on top floor with Stephen Kossoff and Dennis George from FITASA. They were talking about the chaos of government, talking about Renegade, fraud, etc. So it's very much what was topical. But then they said the future was cooperation, and it was the cooperation of the unions and business. Could you comment on that?
Well, I think that's been the biggest downfall, this belief that the tripartite alliance is going to work, because they all have very, very different, very, very different ideologies. You can't escape the reality that what happened in Australia, where the three parties got together, was in fact, or will go down in history as being the reason why it has been able to, in fact, survive better than many countries around the world, the economic crisis. But remember, or not remember, let me tell you what happened in Australia. The notion came from the unions. Because the unions all of a sudden turned around and said, you know what we're doing? We're actually exporting Australia. So all that happened is that manufacturing disappeared to China, to Japan, to Singapore. So their base of union members started to disappear. Not because of retrenchments, but because the businesses just said we can't tolerate it anymore. I think that, and if you look, that the politicians and the unions got together, but they got together because they had got to the tipping point. Australia was about to die. It was called the big hole in the southern hemisphere, where all Billiton and these guys were doing were taking stuff out of the ground and it was going somewhere else. People believe, if you look at that flying logic map, we haven't sunk to that stage yet in this country. We're not there yet. We're getting closer to it every day and we're accelerating towards it. And then maybe you're right, or they are right, that then there will be people that will come up, because remember what he said, once you get chaos, you lose your sense of reality, or your sense of perspective of your current situation changes completely. And that's when we come about. And that's what I think will be the strange attractor. But you see, what's happening? Varvy's come up with a completely new union. Aaron and I heard yesterday, they've got unlimited resources. Piles of people are moving into that environment. And so what's that union going to look like? And how long is it going to take for that union to come to grips with the harsh realities facing South Africa? Creation of jobs, growth of the economy, and all of those sort of things. But yeah, Australia nearly died. I think that's all we're saying, is that you have to die. You have to just about die.
Yeah, I think I'm going to ask the last question, if I may. So you started off by saying we should remember there's still hope for the future. What is it that makes you think that there's still hope for the future? Looking all of this gloom and doom.
Yeah, I think two things are critical. Number one, thank goodness we've got very courageous people who are not scared to speak out in the open, and who are catalyzing a large number of people. So I think the process that's happening, and look, I don't support the civil unrest where it leads to violence and destruction probably. But you know what? I've said to people earlier this morning, when I've spoken to President Zuma, he says, I'm not interested in the coconuts or you white people, because in fact I get the vote from down there.
Yes.
And I said to him, President Zuma, one thing must understand, what happened in Nigeria has got to a stage now which I promise you now, those people in charge do not want to, don't want to hear it. And the other thing is, I think you're starting to see an emergence of interesting things. So in the height of civil unrest colony, a guy's pitched up. I think he's the strange attractor. He was from the community. And it seems that he's going to bring about a semblance of normality there. So I think you're starting to see a lot of this work starting to emerge in South Africa. I'm not going to put any bets on what's going to happen to Cyril Ramaphosa, but what's happened? Is he the strange attractor? Is Willie McKeezy going to be the strange attractor? Is it going to be somebody completely different? And that's why I think it's so fantastic. And I think I've always said, which I didn't put in the slide, there's one thing you can never escape, and that South Africa is a fourth world country. When South Africans' backs are to the wall, they rise up and they go for it. Just think, in 2008, there was a statement that maybe we should move the World Cup to Australia. And Australia was ready to take it.
Yes.
And what happened?
Yeah.
And just look at what we do all the time. You can't rely on it, forever, but the fact is that South Africans, and it doesn't matter who they are, have got this unbelievable, and I think, it's also this naive perception about, look what's happened in the rest of Africa. I firmly believe we're fundamentally different. You would not have seen the overthrow of apartheid in any other country in the way that it took place.
Yeah. So we are resilient.
We're resilient.
Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to conclude with that. I would like to then just welcome you back and welcome you as a professor at Da Vinci. And I'm hoping that we can send you more students, postgrad students. But I'm also hoping that we can have more of what you have spoken about today in writing, that we can share that with the world, that we can share that with our students. Because I'm actively encouraging our students, our postgraduate students, to use systems thinking, systems design thinking as conceptual frames. And it would be wonderful if you could come and talk to them from time to time. So thank you very much once again, and congratulations and welcome.
Thank you very much.